Hey, it's Mike here, and today a response to the corporatization of food. It sounds like an interesting documentary, but no, in this case it is just three meat-loving individuals saying good stuff about meat and bad stuff about plant-based alternatives on Joe Rogan's podcast, which is the #1 podcast and gets like over 10 million listeners per episode. The two guests on the show are Diana Rogers and paleo guy Rob Wolf. You might have heard of them. They're both co-authors of the book The Sacred Cow, which is essentially a humane washing, greenwashing book about meat consumption, promoting it. Maybe we'll touch on that later, but spoiler alert, they do not make any compelling points about like some corporate influence in food and bad effects there. They really just rant about things like Beyond Meat and Bill Gates. But to be fair, they do make some scientifically based claims, so I'm gonna be happy to respond to all of that. Let's just go. And by go, I need to first announce that yes, officially the Iceland trip is ready to go. You can sign up now. The trip is August 11th to 17th this year, and we're gonna have an awesome jam-packed itinerary going all over the place, eating a bunch of vegan food, and the cost of the trip includes this and group transportation. Iceland was one of the bit more costly locations, but you guys chose that, and the total price for the trip is going to be $2,895, but for the first 10 people that get the early bird sign up, that's $150 off, and you don't have to pay everything up front. It's only $680 something to reserve this spot, but there are only 15 total spots, so if you want to do this, you'll have to get on sooner than later. Anyway, link is below. Super excited. Back to the video. At this point, you might be thinking, why do you still respond to Joe Rogan? You've probably responded to him 5 or 6 times. Well, again, #1 podcast, and it really is the case that the claims that are made here essentially trickle down to all of the bros and dads and friends and people. They're gonna make the claims, and it's helpful to at least understand a good research-based response. I wish I could say I'm trying to also convince Joe, but at this point, I think he's pretty set. He had James Wilks come on and absolutely destroy with a ton of good vegan-related research, and then he just repressed that memory deep in his mind and acts as if it never happened. Anyway, let's get on to what Diane starts out by saying at the beginning of the clip.
Meat is the most nutrient-dense, perfect food for humans. It just is.
Yeah, the perfect food for heart disease. I mean, what even is your cholesterol level?
It's such an exhausting conversation when you say that to people, though. Like you said, I think, you eating all that meat, like what about your cholesterol? What about you? You gonna have a heart attack?
See what I did going back in time with the cholesterol thing? Anyway, I've still never seen anybody on that show make a compelling case that cholesterol isn't a concern with meat. I mean, again, I have to say it every video, European Society of Cardiology, high LDL or bad cholesterol is causally linked to atherosclerosis. This is a scientifically accepted view with the most data behind it. Anyway, they pivot pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's working its way into policy, which is really disturbing to me, like as a mother. Like New York City public schools, vegan on Fridays now, in addition to meatless Mondays. So now you've got a school system where 70% of the kids are economically disadvantaged, right? And now you're flanking the weekends with nutrient poor, both Friday and Monday.
She seems to be concerned that these children wouldn't be getting enough meat if they didn't have school lunches, but this is really just a feeling-based argument. She clearly did not look at the data. It's more of a not enough vegetable problem because looking to this study, there was no difference between richer and poorer kids' total meat consumption. It makes sense. Fast food, meat is cheap here. And you don't need to have a specific study to know that lower income children are also not getting enough vegetables because all children are not getting enough vegetables from the CDC. 98% of children are not getting enough vegetables. Only 2% of them are. Probably the vegans. And it gets worse for school lunches, as this study found a while back. School lunch consumption versus not school lunch consumption was associated with a 30% increased risk of obesity. That is not good, and then the obesity in that study was associated with high LDL or bad cholesterol as well. And it ain't because their school lunches are vegan meals. Again, vegan populations in the US average normal BMI, and they are the only dietary group to do so from the Adventist study. But heaven forbid, one city, New York City, tries to increase vegetable consumption and lower atherogenic meat consumption for their children. As a mother, I just can't imagine children having to eat more vegetables. Sadly, Vegan Fridays haven't even been fully vegan yet. They got a rocky start. Anyway, Joe starts to harp on the classics.
And they also say for health purposes, like,
right.
they'll cite the China study.
I'm a vegan. I haven't heard anybody cite the China study in the last 5 years, especially as a compelling point. I haven't mentioned it. It's sort of like the canary in the coal mine study that happened a long time ago. Since then, we've had so much more research in so many areas, and the main concern there was cancer. Well, guess what? Since then, the WHO came out with their cancer declaration for meat, and also we have studies like this meta-analysis showing vegans having 15% lower risk of cancer. Point is, it's corroborated. Next, they get into some statistics that are new that irk them, that it seems that the global burden of disease study has been updated from 2017 to 2019, and it shows that meat is more connected to death than it previously was.
And this is published by The Lancet, and it's what most global food policy is set on. And between their report in 2017 and 2019, meat was 36 times more likely to kill you. And now meat has gone up, do you see this? 36 times more likely to be the cause of death.
How is that?
In 2 years.
And that 36 times increase does sound shocking. It does sound ridiculous and unbelievable, but if you actually look at what's going on, it was going from more or less a neutral risk for death based off whatever model they had before, and then it rose up moderately. I mean, it wasn't anything insane. We'll get more into that in a bit. But I have to mention that that is even dwarfed by the risk that has been put forth by a study like this using high-quality data from the Nurses' Health Study and the health professionals' follow-up saying, quote, "We also estimate that 9.3% of deaths in men and 7.6% in women in our cohorts could be prevented at the end of follow-up if all individuals consumed less than a serving per day of red meat." So it's not out of the blue, but the way they present this storyline is genius when it comes to Joe Rogan viewers, because they eat up conspiracy theories like chum for sharks.
There were some researchers, some friends of mine that pushed back. They wrote a letter to the Lancet, which was blocked.
So what is their motivation?
We don't really know.
I mean, a little tinfoil hatty. I think that there's a powerful desire to consolidate food production globally.
I mean, they love it. The only thing they're missing is adding something about how aliens perform cattle mutilations because cows are just so nutritious. But what's a conspiracy without, you guessed it, Bill Gates?
Yeah.
Gates Foundation is one of the major sponsors of this study that I was just talking
so
about.
So it's f***ery. He keeps saying that we've got to eat less meat, and we've got to cut our consumption of meat out to be healthy, and that we're going to get used to these meat alternatives. When a guy like that says that, I'm like, are you making money because of this?
He then calls Bill Gates obese.
Like, because if you're eating those plant-based burgers or whatever the you're doing, like, you're obese. Like, a guy like that telling people about he's got these breasts
Moobs.
and this gut, and I'm like, this is crazy.
I don't really pay a ton of attention to Bill Gates. I'm not here to defend him or anything, but it's just astounding how he not only A, seems to think that he's obese, that's ridiculous, but B, how he ties that imaginary obesity to the recommendation for plant-based meats, especially in the context of Bill Gates' diet, where he probably built any amount of pudge that he has from eating McDonald's burgers. Yes, there are articles from around 2016 saying that he loves to eat McDonald's. So it's not that he ate too many Beyond Meat burgers throughout his life, it's just that he's loving it a little too much. Anyway. And just to speak to their ridiculous logic, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also funded the 2017 one. They've been funding it for a decade now, so obviously it's not some weird propaganda push. And I also have to mention that they didn't even put meat in the abstract of that study. They are not trying to push it in some conspiratorial fashion. If you wanted to push that message, it would be right there front and center, but then they also expose another flaw with the chart that they show, because a ton of the foods that their camp would like to see have more of a relationship or less of a relationship with death shifted in a favorable direction for them. For example, a lack of whole grains is now considered significantly less lethal. And this is where that 36 times thing seems ridiculous, because if you're actually just looking at the linear movement of that bar, it's way more dramatic for the association of nuts and seeds decreasing in terms of death from low consumption. That moves like 1,500 deaths. They did actually explain some of the changes here. They say they shifted to FAO meat consumption data, and they also updated the disease curve based on newer studies. And to those results, they say their findings support a causal relationship between red meat intake, heart disease, etc. Though, of course, this is epidemiology. It can't determine causality alone. And finally, the recommendation for no negative health effect is 0 grams per day.
According to these researchers, which is going to be global food policy, you can now eat 0 red meat safely.
This notion seems to irk them, but they did not make any research-based compelling case for meat being healthy at all. I mean, I guess they were just sharing some gripes and talking, but still, no case made. But they know the audience they're talking to. Again, they know they love conspiracies, so they say, no, it's a situation where they're hiding the data.
They didn't show any of the evidence, any of the papers they reviewed. And
I always thought that with scientific papers, you had to cite sources and you had to. So
up until about 2 years ago, that was pretty consistent. And then I think we've seen a loosening of standards.
Oh, yeah.
How are they coming to this conclusion?
Right.
Nobody knows.
They
Nobody
just
knows.
tell you?
What's this? On their website, download 2019 global burden of disease data right there. But I have to be fair and agree with him here in the sense that I feel like there's a lack of transparency when it comes to generally having scientists share their methodology. I think that it should be required to be sharing your statistics files, your SPSS files, or whatever you're using. However, this is a problem for the vast majority of studies, those that he probably has used to push meat. Anyway, now we actually get to the main topic at hand, starting to talk a little bit about corporatization of food.
You know, even what is the motivation to do this, then we start getting into conspiracy theory land. It's like, well, there are people that want to control the food system and they want to, you know, turn food into intellectual property that they own. But
You hear that, Granny? Your secret upside down cake recipe makes you a malevolent intellectual property hoarder. This is nothing new. But they just focus on meat alternatives here. And yeah, this is less of a plant-based food problem and more of just a capitalism result.
There's a lot of profit to be made in processing something into a Beyond Burger.
There's a lot of money to be made by literally processing baby cow flesh into something called veal.
On the one side, there's this story that meat will cause cancer and diabetes and all this stuff, and it's going to destroy the planet because of carbon emissions, and it's using all the water and the land, and it's a slick story.
Yeah, the fact that meat is going to harm the planet, that's just a slick story. And you don't mind that human carnivory is likely the leading cause of species extinction globally, the leading cause of dead zones, especially here in the US, that it is a leading, if not the leading, single cause of greenhouse gas emissions, that it uses about a third of our ice-free land, and on and on and on, things that they have all figured out a mental way of denying. But at least on topic here to the Good Food Institute, they've made a chart of plant-based alternative burgers and their impact, and it's clear that between 85 to 90% of greenhouse gas emissions are going to be saved by switching to those main plant-based alternatives.
And by the way, it's twice as expensive. Like Beyond Burger is twice as expensive as organic grass-fed beef per pound.
I'm not sure if that's actually an up-to-date claim, but the cheapness of grass-fed meat is probably because it's likely a feed-lot cow that is being fed grass pellets, and that's compared to a specialty, niche, newer product. There's going to be much lower volume of sales for one, and the goal appears to be, from this recent article, to be price matching with meat sooner than later.
Or that your burger used 10 bathtubs full of water. But then we're not talking about, okay, the most of the water footprint for a cow is actually in the grass. It's called green water. It's like water that's already in the environment, in rain.
I've heard the green water argument before, and it's clear that green water is still a resource. Water that falls onto land is still a very valuable thing, and so it has to be taken into account because it could be used to grow a bunch of other things. Or if you have a major water shortage and you're trying to get as much water as you can in a certain area, that is still water that is going to be allocated to creating animal meat.
Yeah, and I mean,
Plant
it's going
matter.
to fall on this land, which is land that has been grasslands for eons, and we
Right.
can't use it for anything else.
No, this is just a total lie. I mean, we can grow on concrete. It's just a matter of what the consumer dynamics are, the pricing of land, and on and on. It's a choice. Anyway, for more in-depth video on the greenwashing of beef, I have an entire video that goes into the methane issues and the soil capacity for carbon and on and on and on, and I'll link that below. But for some footnotes, the amount of land that we use for pasture and for growing animal feed, if converted 2 trees could offset virtually all of the US's greenhouse gas emissions. I have the whole chart if people want to look at it. But if you really want to talk about the corporatization of food, why don't we just for a moment witness the scale of the meat industry, these slaughterhouses and the factory farming and all of that. We're talking about globally approaching a $1 trillion a year industry. But the influence of these animal industries is huge in terms of things like lobbying and even affecting school lunches. Back to that, I mean, we're talking about the dairy industry having these school lunch programs with all of this cheese and on and on. I have an entire video on that. I feel like I have a video on everything at this point. But looking to lobbying by sector, we can see that the meat industry, minus chicken, is generally lobbying to the US government between $4 and $6 million a year, and dairy is up around $7 million, with Land O'Lakes topping the list. That butter company, I wonder if there's something in butter that you would have to spend money lobbying hiding. Oh, right, that's it, saturated fat. However, when looking at plants and their lobbying, basically every single type of plant is its own lobbying industry. It's way smaller if there is one, and then a lot of it is also feed crop lobbying as well. So this is all akin to pointing at the danger of a minnow in a pond when there is a literal shark in the pond where you're thinking about going swimming. Anyway, you get the idea. In the end, I don't think I need to repeat myself. Going back, poorer children in terms of school lunches, they're eating just as much meat and probably more processed meat. They need to be eating more vegetables. Say it with me. Great. Regardless of your views on Bill Gates, meat is still well associated with mortality. My last video that was way too long and not enough of you watched was all about that. And finally, in terms of that corporatization of food, the problem is the meat giants. Even though these plant-based companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat get a lot of attention, they're not doing the damage, even though they might not be the healthiest food out there. And plant-based alternatives are more eco, and they do not cost animal lives, or at least nearly as many, and not directly, intentionally. Beef, though, is not eco. Anyway, Iceland. If you are interested in going on this trip, you want to do it, I have that link down below. It's going to be pretty incredible, and I'm really excited to be doing more trips in the future. So click a link and become one of the early birds if you want to be. Early bird gets the vegan worm, early bird gets the sunflower seed. That sounds nicer. And if there were vegan worms, they'd probably be like sculpted out of carrots. No one has time for that anyway. Worms are gross. You don't want it. Anyway, I'm done rambling. Feel free to let me know what you thought about all this. I love hearing your comments on Joe Rogan videos, especially. And feel free to like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff that helps me out. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.
But when you've got man boobs and a gut and you're walking around, you have these like toothpick arms, I'm like, hey buddy, you're not healthy.